The advertisement had been folded and unfolded so many times that the paper had gone soft at the creases, and Julia Boone had read it so often she could have recited it in her sleep, which was precisely what she did on the long, rattling train ride west through the autumn of 1878. Wanted, a capable woman of good character to serve as housekeeper and caretaker for a ranch household in Cutter's Creek, Texas. 3 children in residence. References required. Apply in writing to Roscoe Keller, Box 14, Cutter's Creek Post Office. It was not by any measure a romantic advertisement. There was no poetry in it, no promise of adventure, no hint of the sweeping amber skies and endless horizon that Julia would discover when she finally stepped off the stage at Cutter's Creek's Lone Depot on a Wednesday afternoon in October. There was only utility, plain and honest, and that was exactly why Julia had answered it. She had had enough of things dressed up to look like more than they were. She was 26 years old, recently unemployed from her position as a schoolteacher in Memphis, Tennessee, and recently disentangled from an engagement to a man who had turned out to be entirely different from the man he had presented himself to be. She was not heartbroken, exactly. She was tired of pretending, tired of the careful social architecture of Memphis drawing rooms, tired of being told what a woman of her standing ought to want. When she had seen the advertisement pinned to the board outside the post office, something in her chest had gone still and certain in a way she had not felt in years. She had written the letter that same evening. The stagecoach deposited her outside a building that served simultaneously as a post office, a dry goods store, and apparently a barber shop, judging by the striped pole leaning against the wall at a precarious angle. Cutter's Creek was smaller than she had imagined, a single main street of perhaps a dozen buildings, the land around it so vast and flat and golden brown that the town looked like something a child had set down carelessly in the middle of all that openness. The sky above it was a blue so deep and absolute it made her chest ache. She had 2 trunks, a carpet bag, and a letter of instruction that told her to wait at the post office building until someone came to collect her. She waited for 40 minutes, watching a dog sleep in the middle of the road and 2 men argue mildly outside the saloon, before she heard the wagon. He came down the main street at a pace that suggested he was not entirely comfortable with being in town, the horses moving quickly, the wagon kicking up a small plume of dust. He pulled up in front of the post office and climbed down in a single fluid motion, and Julia's first thought was that he was taller than she had expected, though she was not sure why she had expected anything at all. Her second thought was that he looked tired in the specific way of a man who had been tired for a very long time and had stopped noticing it. Roscoe Keller was 32 years old, though he looked perhaps a few years older in the way of men who spent their days outdoors and their nights not sleeping enough. He had dark hair that wanted cutting, a jaw that was shadowed with several days of beard, and eyes the color of the creek water she would later discover actually ran behind the property, a kind of gray-green that changed depending on what the light was doing. He wore a dark hat pulled low and a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the October chill, and he scanned the front of the post office with the focused expression of a man looking for something specific. His eyes landed on her and stopped. "Miss Boone," he said. "Mr. Keller," she said. "I was beginning to wonder if the advertisement had been a fiction." Something moved across his face that might have been the beginning of a smile. "Stage ran early. I apologize for the wait." He did not sound entirely comfortable with the apology, as though courtesy was a language he had once been fluent in and was now a little out of practice with. He picked up both her trunks without asking and loaded them into the wagon bed with the efficiency of a man who had not the time to make a ceremony of things. "It's about 7 miles out," he said. "The road's rough in patches." "I imagine I'll survive," Julia said, and climbed up onto the wagon seat before he could offer to help her, which seemed to catch him off guard in a way that she found quietly satisfying. They drove in silence for the first mile, which suited Julia well enough. She was looking at everything. The land opened up around them as the town fell away behind, the scrub grass and mesquite, an occasional stand of cottonwood, arranging themselves into a landscape that was simultaneously austere and secretly beautiful. The way things sometimes were when you gave them your actual attention instead of your first glance. The sky was beginning to color at the edges with the approach of late afternoon. 3 girls, Roscoe said without preamble. Rosalie is 9, me is 6, and Hattie just turned 4. They're good children. He said the last part with the slight defensiveness of a man who was prepared for someone to suggest otherwise. I'm sure they are, Julia said. There's one rule I need to be clear about before we arrive, he said. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, his hands loose on the reins. The girls lost their mother 14 months ago. They don't need anyone to replace her. They need someone steady and capable who will treat them well. I don't want anyone playing at being their mother or trying to step into a role that isn't theirs. Just be their caretaker. Clear and kind, but clear. Julia looked at his profile. The line of his jaw was set in a way that told her this was not a casual instruction. This was something he had thought about carefully and had perhaps said before to someone who had not honored it. I understand, she said. Do you? He said, not unkindly, just precisely. I do, she said. I'm not here to play at anything, Mr. Keller. I came because I needed honest work and you needed honest help. I have no designs on anyone's role. He nodded once slowly, and something in his shoulders settled fractionally. The rule stands, he said. The rule stands, she agreed. She broke the rule on the first day. It happened at supper, the evening of her arrival. The house was a good solid structure, larger than she had expected, with a kitchen that had real wooden floors and a cookstove that was better than the one she had left behind in Memphis. Roscoe had shown her the room that would be hers, a small clean space at the back of the house with a window that looked out toward the creek, and then he had gone back out to finish the evening chores and left her to find her bearings. She had found her bearings by meeting the girls. Rosalie, the oldest at 9, had the same gray-green eyes as her father and a gravity to her that was something to see in a child, a careful watching quality, as though she had decided to reserve judgment on the world and most of its inhabitants until further evidence could be gathered. She shook Julia's hand with great formality and said, "How do you do?" which was both charming and slightly heartbreaking. Me, 6 years old, had a gap between her front teeth and an immediate, uncomplicated energy that expressed itself by showing Julia every room in the house in rapid succession, including the pantry, the cellar stairs, and the spot behind the barn where she had found an interesting rock shaped like a horse's head. Me's grief, if she carried it, was buried under the kind of forward momentum that 6-year-olds are capable of, though Julia would later learn that it surfaced in other ways. And then there was Hattie. Hattie was 4 years old and had dark curls that were currently in a state of profound disorder and a smear of something that might have been jam across one cheek. She had appeared in the kitchen doorway while Julia was surveying the pantry, and she had stood very still for a long moment, studying Julia with the frank, unedited assessment of a small child, and then she had walked directly to Julia's side and taken hold of her skirt. She did not say anything. She simply held on. Julia had stood there for a moment, looking down at this small, dark-haired child with her jam-smeared cheek and her absolute certainty that holding on was the right thing to do, and she had felt something shift in her chest, something warm and certain, and she had understood with perfect clarity that she was about to break the rule. She put her hand on Hattie's head and smoothed down those wild curls. Hattie turned her face up and smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had no defense against it. At supper, which Julia had made from the supplies in the pantry, a simple meal of salt pork and cornbread, and the last of what turned out to be a very good batch of preserved peaches, Hattie had climbed into Julia's lap before she had even finished sitting down. She had settled there with the completeness of a child who has decided the matter and considers it closed, and she had eaten her supper from that position, and Julia had let her, because what else does a person do? Roscoe had come in from the evening chores and stopped in the kitchen doorway, and his eyes had gone immediately to Hattie in Julia's lap, and Julia had looked back at him steadily, waiting for whatever would come. He had looked at his youngest daughter, who was currently eating a piece of cornbread with the concentration of a surgeon, and then he had looked at Julia, and something had passed across his face that was complicated and layered and impossible to read entirely, and then he had simply said, "Supper smells good," and sat down at the table, and not another word was said about it. Not that evening. He said it the next morning instead. She was at the cook stove when he came in from the early chores before the girls were up, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before he said, "Yesterday, with Hattie." She turned to face him. "I know," she said. "I know what you told me, and I know what I agreed to. She climbed into my lap and I let her. I'm not going to apologize for it, but I understand if it changes your view of whether I'm the right person for this position." He was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was full of the sound of the fire and the smell of coffee and the early light coming sideways through the window. "She hasn't done that with anyone," he said, "since her mother." His voice was careful, measured, like a man walking across uncertain ground. "The women from town who have come to help out these past months, she wouldn't go near them." Julia waited. "She's not wrong about people, Hattie," he said. "She never has been." He paused. "I'm not taking it back. The rule stands. But I'm also not asking you to refuse my 4-year-old when she wants someone to hold on to." He looked at the floor for a moment and then back up. "That's a different thing." "I think it is too," Julia said. He poured himself a cup of coffee and drank it standing at the window, looking out at the early light, and she returned to the cook stove, and neither of them said anything more, and somehow the silence felt like an agreement, like something new and tentative had been laid down carefully between them and was now being allowed to settle. The first week unfolded in the manner of things that are both difficult and necessary. Julia learned the rhythms of the house and the land around it with the same methodical attention she had once applied to memorizing state capitals and multiplication tables. She learned that the cook stove pulled hotter on the left side. She learned that Me was afraid of the dark but would not admit it, and that a lamp left burning low in the hallway solved the problem without anyone having to discuss it. She learned that Rosalie did her worrying on the inside, and that if she looked pale at breakfast, it usually meant something had been troubling her since before dawn, and that the best approach was to give her a task that required her hands and her attention, and then talk quietly beside her while she worked, so the words could come out sideways if they wanted to. She learned that Roscoe Keller ran his ranch with a precision that was almost mathematical, that he was never idle, that he could repair almost anything with wire and patience, and that he took his coffee black and his opinions the same way. She also learned, gradually, that the tiredness in him ran deeper than insufficient sleep. His wife's name had been Catherine. Me mentioned her with the easy naturalness of a child who has not yet learned that talking about the dead is considered difficult, and from Me's cheerful reminiscences, Julia gathered that Catherine Keller had been a practical, warm woman who had made good pie and had a laugh that carried across the yard. She had died of a fever 14 months ago, in August of the previous year, and she had been 30 years old. Julia did not ask Roscoe about Catherine directly. She understood without being told that this was not a door he had unlocked for her or for anyone. But she watched him sometimes in the evenings, when the girls were in bed and he sat at the table with the ranch accounts spread before him, or with some piece of equipment that needed mending, and she noticed the way he sometimes stopped working and simply looked at nothing for a long moment, as though he was in a conversation she couldn't hear. She did not intrude on those moments. She simply went on with whatever she was doing, and she let him have them. The town of Cutter's Creek had its own opinion about Julia Boone's arrival, as small towns in the west of 1878 inevitably did. The population was perhaps 300 souls, a mixture of ranching families, a handful of merchants, the men who worked the cattle drives that passed through twice a year, and the various individuals who had drifted out to the frontier for reasons they kept private. There was a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a saloon, a general store run by a man named Hargrove who seemed to have his finger on the pulse of every piece of gossip within a 10-mile radius, and a small hotel that served meals to travelers. Julia met the town on her second Saturday, when Roscoe drove them all in for supplies. She was aware of the interested glances from the women on the dry goods porch, the way conversations shifted when she and Roscoe walked into Hargrove's store. A woman named Dorothea Marsh, who appeared to be the particular center of gravity around which Cutter's Creek's social life organized itself, introduced herself with great warmth and a set of eyes that were simultaneously friendly and cataloging. "You're the woman Roscoe brought on," Dorothea said, as though Julia might need confirmation of this fact. "I am," Julia said pleasantly. "Julia Boone. Memphis, wasn't it? I heard Memphis." Dorothea had the satisfied air of a woman who prided herself on knowing things. "Well, you've landed yourself in quite a different kind of place. Are you finding it very difficult? I imagine it's quite a shock coming from a city." "I'm finding it very interesting," Julia said, which was entirely true and also neatly declined to give Dorothea the admission of struggle she was looking for. Dorothea's eyes moved to where Roscoe was loading supplies into the wagon, and then back to Julia with a particular knowingness that Julia was familiar enough with human nature to understand. The town was watching to see what this woman from Memphis was going to do in Roscoe Keller's house, and whether whatever she did was going to be interesting or scandalous or both. Julia smiled, said something polite about the weather, and went to help me choose a penny candy from the jar on Hargrove's counter. What Julia did not know, and would not learn until later, was that there had been a woman before her, a woman from a town about 30 miles east named Mrs. Alma Prout, a widow who had come to help with the girls 6 months after Catherine's death. Mrs. Prout had apparently decided that Roscoe's bereavement was something she could solve by becoming his wife as efficiently as possible, and had made her intentions clear enough that Roscoe had asked her to leave inside of 2 weeks. She had told several people in Cutter's Creek that Roscoe was a cold man, and that his household was a sorrowful one, and those words had traveled the way words travel in small places, and some of that reputation had settled around the Keller ranch like a particular kind of dust. It was Rosalie who told Julia about Mrs. Prout, about 3 weeks after Julia's arrival. They were mending shirts together on the porch on a cool afternoon, the kind of companionable work that loosens the tongue, and Rosalie said, without looking up from her needle, she kept trying to sit in Mama's chair. Julia did not ask who, she understood. "The one at the end of the table," she said. "Yes," Rosalie said. She pulled her thread through. "Papa never said anything about it directly, but I could tell it made him unhappy. She tried to change where things were kept in the kitchen, too. Mama always kept the flour by the window, and she moved it to the shelf by the door, and Papa went to get it where it had always been, and it wasn't there, and he just stood there for a long minute." Rosalie's voice was very even, very controlled, the voice of a 9-year-old who had taken it upon herself to carry more than she should. "I think it scared him, feeling like things were being changed." Julia set down the shirt she was mending. "Rosalie," she said, "I need you to know something." Rosalie looked up. "I have not moved anything," Julia said, "and I don't plan to, not unless your father asks me to, or it's something that simply has to be done for the running of the house. This is your home and his home and your sister's home, and it has your mother in it still in the way that homes do. I'm not here to change that." Rosalie looked at her for a long moment with those careful, measuring eyes. "You moved the kindling," she said. Julia blinked. Then she looked at the porch, where the kindling box sat, and then she thought back to her first morning when she had moved it 6 inches to the left because it had been awkward to reach from the cook stove, and she had not thought twice about it. "I did," she said. "I'm sorry, I did it without thinking." Rosalie shook her head slowly. "It was in a silly place anyway. Mama always said she was going to move it, she just never got around to it." A small, complicated smile crossed the girl's face, the first real smile Julia had seen from her. I think she would have approved. Julia felt something in her throat that she did not allow to become anything. She picked her mending back up. "Good," she said. "Then I'll leave it where it is." They sewed in silence for a while, the comfortable kind. It was in the fourth week that Roscoe Keller looked at Julia Boone and did not look away. It was evening, one of those evenings in late October that are more beautiful than anything has a right to be. The sky doing things with color that would have seemed excessive if you described them. The air cool and smelling of the creek and the dry grass. The girls were inside getting ready for bed. Roscoe had come around the side of the house and found Julia standing at the fence at the edge of the kitchen garden, looking west at the sunset, and he had stopped because she was doing something he had not seen her do before. She was simply being still, not working, not purposeful, not on her way to or from anything. Just standing with her hands on the fence rail and her face turned to the sky, and she had taken off her apron and her hair was coming loose from its pins in the evening wind, and she looked like she was listening to something. He stood there for a moment longer than he intended to, and when she turned and saw him, he did not manage to look away quickly enough, and they both knew it. "The sunsets here are something," Julia said, and her voice was ordinary but her cheeks had a color that was not entirely from the wind. "They are," he said. He walked to the fence and stood beside her, not close, the precise amount of distance that propriety required. They watched the last of the light together for a minute or two, and then he said, "You're settling in all right." "I am," she said. "The girls like you." He said it like a fact he was reporting. "I like them," she said. "They're remarkable, all three of them in very different ways. Rosalie gave you those eyes of hers the first few days," he said. "She doesn't do that for everyone." She stopped, Julia said. "I think we reached an understanding." He looked at her sideways in the last of the sunset light. "What kind of understanding?" "The kind where she knows I'm not pretending," Julia said. "Children always know. They're better at that than adults are." He was quiet for a moment. "That's probably true," he said. The evening star had appeared by the time they went back inside. November came in with cold winds and the first real frost. The days were full and physical, the kind of days that leave you tired in a satisfying way, the kind Julia had not known since her childhood on her family's farm in Tennessee before her father had moved them to the city. She was up before dawn. She ran the household with a quiet competence that asked nothing for itself. She taught the girls things in the evenings because the schoolhouse was 2 miles away, and the winter mud made it impractical for me and Hattie to go daily. And she read aloud to them after supper, novels and poetry, and the agricultural almanac when they ran short of novels. Roscoe listened. He sat at the table with his work and he listened. And she knew he did because sometimes when she paused to turn a page, he would already know what she was about to say before she said it, would finish a sentence under his breath without seeming to realize he was doing it. She had started finding small things. A piece of kindling placed ready beside the stove before she had to fetch it herself. A loose board on the porch steps that she had been meaning to mention repaired without her having said anything. A jar of the preserved peaches, the ones she had mentioned at breakfast, were running low, restocked without explanation. Small things, quiet things, the language of someone who was paying attention. She began leaving things too. His coffee cup warm on the back of the stove when he came in from the late chores. A piece of pie set aside that was still good when everything else had been eaten. His hat moved from where he had dropped it to where he would reach for it in the morning. It was its own conversation, conducted entirely in acts and objects, entirely without words, and both of them were fluent in it before either of them named what it was. The event that forced everything into the open, or at least partially into the open, came in the second week of November in the form of a man named Craddock. He rode in on a Thursday afternoon, which was a day Julia happened to be alone at the ranch with the girls, Roscoe having ridden out to the north pasture to see about a fence. Craddock was a broad man in his 40s with a broken nose that had healed at an angle and the particularly unpleasant manner of a man who was accustomed to getting his way through persistence and size. He said he was looking for Roscoe Keller on a matter of land, which was apparently a dispute about the boundary of the east grazing field that he claimed ran back several years. Julia told him Roscoe was away and would return by evening, and she offered him a glass of water for his horse and said he was welcome to wait in town. Craddock did not want to wait in town. He wanted to wait at the ranch, specifically at the kitchen table, and he had a way of not moving that made the request feel like something other than a request. Julia looked at him for a moment. Behind her in the kitchen, she could hear Me and Rosalie doing their lessons, the sound of Hattie's wooden blocks being stacked and knocked over. She thought about the fact that Roscoe was 7 miles away, and there was no way to reach him in the immediate term. "I think you'll be more comfortable at the hotel," she said, and her voice was completely level. "Tell them to put the meal on Mr. Keller's account, and he'll settle it when he comes in on Saturday. He can address your land matter then." Craddock looked at her for a long moment with the assessing look of a man deciding whether he wanted to pursue the matter, and Julia held his gaze with the steady patience of a schoolteacher who had handled far more complicated confrontations across desks. There was a moment of balance, and then Craddock looked away first and made a sound that might have been agreement and rode back toward town. Julia stood on the porch until he was out of sight, and then went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and held very still until her hands stopped trembling. When Roscoe came in that evening, she told him about Craddock directly, including the part about her hands trembling because it seemed important to be accurate. Roscoe listened without interrupting. His face went through several things while she talked, none of them good. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You handled that right," he said. "I know," she said. "I wasn't asking for your verdict. I'm telling you because you need to know about the land dispute and about Craddock." Something in his face changed at that. He looked at her as though she had said something surprising, though she was not sure what. Then he said, "Craddock's been trying to push my east boundary for 3 years. There's a deed that settles it clearly in my favor, and he knows it. He comes around when he thinks he can find an easier target." His jaw tightened. "He won't find one here." "No," Julia said. "He won't." He looked at her across the table with an expression she was beginning to learn, a particular kind of directness that was not quite the same as looking at you and was closer to looking for you. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am," she said. "I was rattled for about 5 minutes. I'm fine now." He nodded. He did not say anything else, but he stayed at the kitchen table that evening rather than going to the barn to do the late work he usually put off until after supper, and Julia understood this was its own kind of answer. He rode to town the following morning and dealt with Craddock and the deed, and when he came back, he said only that the matter was settled, and she believed him, because there was a finality in the way he said it that suggested Craddock had been left with no reasonable alternative but to agree. December brought cold that was not Memphis cold, which was a damp, creeping thing, but West Texas cold, which was dry and direct and honest about itself, the kind of cold that comes with a blue sky and bright sun and air like ice water. The girls wanted snow and did not get it, but they got frost on the kitchen window in elaborate patterns that Hattie pressed her nose against every morning. Julia had started teaching Rosalie to cook in earnest, and Rosalie took to it with the focused seriousness she took to everything, her brow furrowed over the cookstove as though she were solving a puzzle. Me, meanwhile, had attached herself to Julia's reading lessons with a devotion that was touching. Me was not naturally a reader. She was naturally a mover and a doer, but Julia had discovered that if you let me read about things that she actually wanted to do, the riding and the animals and the weather, she would work through the difficult words with a determination that surprised them both. Julia had written away to the bookseller in San Antonio for a particular set of books about horses and natural history, and when they arrived, Me had carried them around the house for an entire day before she would even open them. Hattie remained Hattie, which was to say she remained herself with complete commitment. She called Julia Miss Ju, because the full name was apparently beyond the patience she chose to apply to names, and she brought Julia things from around the ranch that she considered significant: a particular stone, a feather, a piece of bark with an interesting pattern, and these accumulated on the windowsill of Julia's room with the solemnity of offerings. On the evening of the 15th of December, Roscoe came in from the barn and found Julia sitting on the floor of the sitting room with all three girls asleep around her. Rosalie and me had their heads together on the braided rug, faces smooth in sleep, and Hattie was curled against Julia's side with Julia's arm around her, and Julia herself was very nearly asleep, her chin dropping, a book open in her lap. Roscoe stood in the doorway. He stood there for a long time. Julia roused when she heard him and looked up and found him looking at all of them with an expression she had not seen on him before, something unguarded and aching, something that had no performance in it. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, careful not to wake the girls. "We were reading and then we weren't." "Don't be," he said. His voice was low, rough at the edges. "I'll carry them up." He carried me and Rosalie to their room with the practiced ease of a man who had been doing it for years, and then he came back for Hattie, and Julia transferred Hattie's sleeping weight to his arms with a care that brought them briefly close, her hands and his at once occupied with the same small person, and for a moment they were 6 inches apart in the lamplight and neither of them moved. Then he straightened with Hattie and turned toward the stairs, and Julia sat there with her book in her lap, and her heart going at a speed that was entirely unreasonable for someone who had merely been sitting on a floor. She heard him come back down. He appeared in the sitting room doorway again. "They sleep well when you read to them," he said. "They're good listeners," she said. He stayed in the doorway, one hand on the frame, and there was a weight in the room that had not been there before, or perhaps had been there for a while and was only now making itself evident. "Julia," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name and they both knew it. She looked at him. "I know I said what I said when you arrived," he said. He was choosing his words with the care of a man who did not often have to find words for things like this. "About what your role was and what it wasn't, and I meant it when I said it. I meant every word of it." "I know you did," she said. "But I didn't know then," he said. He stopped. He looked at the floor for a moment and then back at her. "I didn't know what it would be like, having someone in this house who was really here, not going through the motions of it, really here." He paused again and she waited because she understood that interrupting this would be a kind of harm. "It's been a long time since this house felt like this in the evenings." "Like what?" she asked softly. "Like somewhere a person might want to come back to," he said. The silence that followed was the kind that asks a question. "I want to be clear that I'm not going anywhere," Julia said. "If that's what you're wondering." "That's not entirely what I'm wondering," he said. She stood up from the floor because the conversation felt like one that required her to be standing. She looked at him across the small sitting room, the lamp throwing warm light between them, outside the windows the cold dark of a West Texas December. "Then what are you wondering?" she said. He crossed the room in 4 steps, which given the size of the room was not dramatic but felt so, and he stopped in front of her close enough that she had to look up, and he looked at her with those gray-green eyes that had been measuring the world since the moment she had first seen them, and he said, "Whether you see this the way I see it." "I see it exactly the way you see it," she said. He put one hand against her jaw, careful and deliberate, and she turned her face into it slightly, a small involuntary thing that told him everything. And then he kissed her, and it was quiet and certain, and nothing like the operatic productions she had read about in novels. It was simply 2 people who had been paying close attention to each other for 2 months, and had arrived at the only logical conclusion. When they stepped back from each other, he kept his hand on her jaw for a moment, and his eyes were doing something complicated and good. "I should have done that with better timing," he said. "We're standing in the sitting room at 10 o'clock with 3 children asleep upstairs." "The timing seems fine to me," Julia said. Something happened to his face that she had not seen before, something that was unambiguously happiness, brief and bright like the sun off creek water. He was quiet for a moment looking at her, and then he said, "I'll talk to Reverend Aldrich in the new year, if that's something you want. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight." "It's something I want," she said. He nodded once slowly, and the happiness in his face settled into something quieter and more permanent, something that looked like it intended to stay. Christmas at the Keller Ranch that year was the kind of thing that gets folded into family memory and becomes, over time, the standard against which other Christmases are measured. Julia had written to her older sister in Memphis, and the sister had sent a package with ribbons and a bolt of green cloth and a small bottle of vanilla extract, which was a luxury Julia had not expected. She made the green cloth into a dress for Hattie and a hair ribbon for me, and she baked sugar cookies with all 3 girls on Christmas Eve, which resulted in approximately 2 dozen presentable cookies and one truly spectacular mess that Hattie was very proud of. Roscoe cut a cedar from the south pasture, a small one, and they decorated it with paper shapes the girls made and a string of cranberries that me strung with immense industry and only minor damage to her fingertips. On Christmas morning, Roscoe gave each girl a gift he had made himself: a small carved horse for Hattie, a leather-bound journal for Rosalie's worrying and writing, and for me a handmade bridle scaled to the size of the pony she had been promised in the spring. Julia had sewn each of them a new nightgown from fabric she had found in the dry goods store, and Roscoe had left a package at her door on Christmas morning that turned out to be a book she had mentioned wanting, a collection of poems she had not been able to find in the Memphis bookstore before she left, ordered at some point from somewhere she had not tracked. She stood in her room doorway holding the book and looked at him at the breakfast table, and he was very deliberately not looking at her, but the tips of his ears were red in a way that made her smile. The new year came in cold and clear, and Roscoe went to see Reverend Aldrich on the 3rd day of January, 1879. He came back at mid-afternoon and found Julia in the kitchen, and he said without preface, because that was how he was, "March, if that works for you." "March works for me," she said. Rosalie, who had been doing her reading at the kitchen table and had apparently been listening, said, without looking up from her book, "Good." And that was all she said, but Julia caught the small curve of her mouth and felt something warm and definitive settle in her chest. Me needed more discussing. She cornered Julia 2 days later with the directness that was her particular gift and said, "Are you going to be our stepmother? Dorothea Marsh's girl said you were going to be our stepmother." "I'm going to marry your father," Julia said. "What that makes me is between you and me and your sisters to decide." Me considered this with great seriousness. "Can I still call you Miss Ju?" she said, borrowing Hattie's name without apparently realizing she was doing it. "You can call me whatever you like," Julia said. Me thought about it for another moment and then said, "Okay," and ran outside, apparently satisfied. The negotiation had taken approximately 90 seconds, which was more efficient than most of the adult conversations Julia had had on the subject. January and February were long months, beautiful in their austerity, the land locked into a cold stillness that was not unfriendly, the sky clear and enormous. Julia and Roscoe found their evenings, after the girls were in bed, becoming a small and quiet kind of courtship. He told her things about the ranch, the history of the land he had bought 12 years ago with money saved from 4 years of cattle drives, the way he had built the house piece by piece over those first years, the particular qualities of each pasture and what they were good for. She told him about Memphis and the school where she had taught, about her family, about her father who had died when she was 20 and her mother who had gone to live with Julia's sister, about the engagement she had left behind and the relief of leaving it. He listened to the part about the engagement with the careful attention of a man who wants to understand something fully before he forms a view on it. "Did he hurt you?" he said, meaning it in a specific way. "No," she said. "He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had a version of me that he wanted to be true, and when it wasn't, he was disappointed, and he was not quiet about it." Roscoe looked at her for a long moment. "What version did he want?" "A quieter one," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, a brief, exhaled thing, as though the idea was absurd to him. "I've never wanted a quieter one," he said, and she felt the warmth of it through her whole chest. There was an evening in February when she came upon him in the barn at the workbench, repairing a piece of harness by lamplight, and she sat on a hay bale and talked with him for 2 hours about nothing and everything. The winter stars visible through the barn door, the horses shifting quietly in their stalls, the smell of hay and lamp oil and the good honest smell of work. And she thought, in the middle of saying something ordinary about the price of flour and the spring planting, that she was completely and entirely happy in a way she had not been in a very long time, possibly ever, and the thought sat inside her chest like something lit. On the 20th of February there was a dance at the church hall in Cutter's Creek, a winter social that the town held every year, and Roscoe took Julia and all 3 girls. This was the first time Julia had appeared in town in an explicitly social context rather than a practical one, and she was aware of the eyes, Dorothea Marsh's in particular, moving between her and Roscoe with a particular thoroughness. She did not care. She had reached the age and the place in herself where other people's assessments of her situation were interesting rather than troubling. Roscoe danced with her twice, which was what the social conventions of Cutter's Creek permitted without creating discussion, and both times he danced with the same precision and quiet attention he brought to everything, and she found she enjoyed dancing with a man who was fully present in it. Me danced with 3 different boys her age with the unself-conscious enthusiasm that was her particular genius. Rosalie danced once and spent the rest of the evening in a corner with another quiet, serious child, deep in a conversation that appeared to be about horses. Hattie fell asleep in Julia's shawl during the 2nd hour and stayed there, solidly and peacefully asleep, through everything. It was during the 2nd dance that Roscoe said, close to her ear so she could hear him over the music, "People are going to talk about this." "People have been talking about this since October," Julia said. "They'll talk more." "Let them," she said. "I'm dancing with the man I intend to marry in 6 weeks. They can talk all they like." He looked at her with those steady eyes, and then he did something she had not seen him do before in public. He smiled, a real one, not the small controlled thing she had seen occasionally in private moments, but a full and open smile, and it transformed his face so completely that she felt herself staring. Dorothea Marsh, she noticed from the corner of her eye, saw the smile too, and her expression went from speculative to something that might have been, actually, genuine. March arrived with alternating warm days and cold nights, and the smell of things beginning to wake up in the ground. The wedding was on the 17th, a Saturday, in the church that also served as the schoolhouse. It was not a large ceremony. Reverend Aldrich, who was a small, energetic man with a genuine warmth that Julia appreciated, had a way of conducting services that felt personal rather than procedural. Rosalie stood very straight through the whole thing with her hands folded and her face composed, and halfway through she reached out and took Julia's hand without looking at her, and Julia held on. Me cried, which surprised everyone including me, who was mortified by this, and wiped her face with considerable energy, and then stared straight ahead as though daring anyone to mention it. Hattie sat on a pew between Rosalie and me, and appeared to find the entire proceedings moderately interesting, periodically standing up to get a better view, and had to be gently redirected by Rosalie on 3 separate occasions. Roscoe had dressed with more care than Julia had ever seen from him, a dark coat that fit well and a white shirt, and a cravat that he had clearly tied and retied several times before arriving at a version he considered acceptable. He was nervous, which she could tell because he was very still, the way he got when he was containing something. But when she came down the aisle of the little church with her hand on the arm of Tom Aldrich's eldest son, who had been pressed into service as a stand-in for her absent family, and Roscoe looked at her, the stillness changed. The containing stopped. He just looked at her, openly and entirely, and she looked back at him, and whatever the Reverend said in the next few minutes was secondary to the conversation that was happening between the two of them across the small distance of the church aisle. "I do," she said, when the time came, and she meant it with every specific and unglamorous and real thing that she had learned about this man and this life in 5 months of actual living beside it. "I do," he said, and the simplicity of it, the plain and absolute directness of it, was the most romantic thing she had ever heard. They went back to the ranch that afternoon as the Keller family, all 5 of them, and that evening Julia made a meal with the good cuts of beef she had been saving, and the last of the stored sweet potatoes, and a pie that used the remainder of the vanilla extract her sister had sent at Christmas. And the 5 of them sat at the table together and ate it. And the conversation was ordinary and comfortable and full of the small specific details of the lives they shared. Who had seen the first robin of the season, and whether the south pasture fence was going to need work before the spring cattle arrived, and what book they would start next in the evenings. After supper, after the girls were in bed, Roscoe and Julia sat together on the porch in the cold March dark, the stars extraordinary overhead, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him and they were quiet for a long while. "This is different than I thought it would be," he said eventually. "Starting over." "Different how?" she said. "I thought it would feel like a compromise," he said. "Like settling for the possible instead of the thing you'd wanted." He paused and his arm tightened slightly. "It doesn't feel like that." "No," she said, "it doesn't. It feels like something I didn't know to want," he said, "because I didn't know it was possible." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know someone could come into something this specific and particular and already full of history and just fit into it. Not bend it, not replace what was there. Just fit." Julia thought about this. She thought about Catherine, who had made good pie and had a laugh that carried across the yard, and who had left 3 daughters and a man who had been tired for a very long time, and who was still present in the house in the way that people are when they have genuinely been loved in a place. "I'm not replacing anyone," she said. "I know you're not," he said. "That's what I'm saying." She looked up at the stars, which were doing what West Texas stars do on clear March nights, which is to be completely overwhelming in their abundance. "I didn't know either," she said. "I didn't know I wanted this specifically. I thought I wanted something simpler, something easier. And then I got here and it turned out what I wanted was this." She gestured vaguely at the dark ranch and the house with its warm windows and the 7 miles to the nearest town and the 3 children upstairs. "Exactly this." He pressed a kiss to her hair and she felt the warmth of it all the way through. Spring arrived with a fullness that was almost aggressive, the land going from brown to green in what felt like a matter of days, the creek running high with snowmelt from somewhere far north, the mesquite putting out its tiny yellow flowers that smelled, implausibly, sweet. The cattle came up from the southern pastures, and the ranch's days expanded into the particular industry of a Texas spring, the branding and the counting and the fence mending and the planting. Julia had learned to ride in the first months, not gracefully but competently, on a patient bay mare named Dulcie, who seemed to have made a personal decision to tolerate being taught on. By spring she was riding daily, and on the afternoons when the girls were at the schoolhouse and Roscoe needed someone to check the fence line on the east pasture, she did it, and came back with the reports of what needed fixing with the accuracy he had come to expect from her. "You didn't want to ride when you arrived," he said, one evening observing this. "I didn't say I didn't want to," she said. "I said I hadn't." "There's a difference," he said, with the slight smile that had become something she looked for the way you look for the North Star, not because you need constant direction, but because you like knowing it's there. Rosalie finished her 9th year and turned 10 in April, and Julia made her a cake with strawberry preserves, and Roscoe gave her a new set of pencils for her drawing, which Rosalie had taken up with the same focused intensity she brought to reading and mending and worrying. She was beginning to be genuinely good at it, and Julia had written to her sister in Memphis for drawing paper, the good kind, which arrived in May and which Rosalie accepted with a composure that did not conceal the brightness in her eyes. In June, Julia realized she was going to have a child. She told Roscoe on a Sunday morning in the kitchen before the girls were up, in the same plain and direct way she had developed for telling him important things. She simply said, "I'm going to have a baby, I think in December or January." He was sitting at the table with his coffee and he set the cup down and looked at her. "Are you sure?" he said. "I'm sure enough," she said. "I'll know more certainly in another month." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at his hands on the table, and she waited because she had learned that his quiet was never indifference. It was always attention. "Are you all right?" he said. "How are you feeling?" "I'm feeling fine," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but fine." He pushed back his chair and came to her and put both his hands on her face, tilting it up, and looked at her in the way she had come to understand was specific to moments of something large. "Good," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "That's good." "You're not worried," she said, which was half a question. "I'm always a little worried," he said honestly. "That's just how I'm made, but I'm not unhappy." He pulled her forward against him and held on. "I'm not unhappy at all." She felt his arms around her in the morning kitchen, and she felt the absolute safety of being known by someone and stood in it for a long moment. The girls were told at breakfast. Me's reaction was immediate and operatic, a combination of delight and the rapid generation of names for the baby, all of which she offered in rapid succession, none of which were ultimately used but all of which were recorded in Rosalie's journal for posterity. Rosalie herself said with great calm, "I thought so," which was very characteristic of her and which made Roscoe nearly choke on his coffee. Hattie, who was now 4.5 and had a slightly improved relationship with language, though not with the concept of restraint, said baby with great enthusiasm and then immediately returned to her breakfast, which was also very characteristic of her. The summer of 1879 was a warm one, long days of work and evening rides, and the kind of life that, if you had the habit of measuring contentment, you would have had to use a different measuring system for. Julia's pregnancy was uncomplicated, a mercy she did not take for granted, having understood enough from the way Roscoe sometimes went quiet in the right circumstances that Catherine's last year had been marked by a health that was gradually less certain than it should have been. She was frank with him about this, frank about the fact that she was well and that she intended to stay well. And she was also honest enough with herself to know that the frontier in 1879 offered no guarantees on this or much else. There was a doctor in Redmond, 18 miles away, a Dr. Forsyth, who was a competent man in his 50s who had been practicing medicine in West Texas for 20 years, and who came out to the ranch in August to confirm what Julia already knew, and to assess her general condition with a thoroughness that satisfied both her and the particular quality of Roscoe's attentiveness that week. "Healthy woman, healthy pregnancy," Dr. Forsyth said, closing his bag. "Come see me in November and we'll decide whether to bring you to town for the confinement or manage it here." They managed it at the ranch, as it turned out. In the first days of January 1880, on a night when the cold was absolute and the stars were clear and the girls were asleep down the hall, Julia Boone Keller had a son. He was born at 2 in the morning with Dr. Forsyth in attendance, the birth long and hard in the particular way that births are when they are real rather than arranged for narrative convenience, but ultimately well. And when Julia held him for the first time she was so tired she was nearly transparent, and she looked at Roscoe over the top of this new person's head, and he looked back at her with something in his face that she thought she might spend the rest of her life being glad she had seen. "A boy," she said, unnecessarily. "A boy," he said. His voice was wrecked. They named him Thomas Emmett Keller, Thomas for the Reverend who had married them and Emmett for Roscoe's father who had died when Roscoe was young. They called him Tom from the first day, and Tom turned out to be a solid, cheerful infant who slept with a dedication that made all three of his sisters regard him with something approaching professional envy. Hattie, now 5, considered Tom her personal project. She was helpful in the specific way of a 5-year-old, which is to say thoroughly and sometimes inconveniently. But her affection for him was absolute and uncomplicated, and she took a proprietary interest in his development that amused Julia greatly. Rosalie became quietly indispensable in the way she always did with things she cared about, understanding what needed doing before she was asked, appearing with things at the right moment, keeping me from being too loud when Tom was sleeping, keeping track of things that needed tracking. She was 10 now and a half, and she had her mother's practicality and her father's precision and something that was entirely her own, a kind of capable grace, a capacity to hold things together without making it look like work. Me adored Tom with the full energy she brought to everything, and was persuaded only with considerable effort that he did not yet need to be taught to ride. Spring came again, and summer, and the ranch moved through its seasons with the reliable rhythms of land that is well tended. Roscoe's east boundary dispute had been settled once and finally in the previous autumn, the deed producing exactly the legal finality he had promised, and Craddock had taken his operation 20 miles south and out of their lives with a permanence that Julia found satisfying. The ranch was doing well, better than well. The cattle numbers had grown, and Roscoe had hired 2 hands, brothers named Elias and Cobb Wheeler, who were good workers and easy to have around the place. Dorothea Marsh, of all people, had become something like a friend. Julia had revised her initial reading of Dorothea, understanding over time that the woman's thoroughness about knowing things was less gossip and more a genuine and slightly overwhelming care for her community, and that her initial assessment of Julia had eventually resolved into a thorough approval that she expressed by appearing with food at strategic moments, and by being the kind of person you could talk honestly to when you needed it. It was Dorothea who told Julia, in a conversation over the store counter in the spring of 1880, that there had been a great deal of talk when Julia first arrived about whether the schoolhouse needed a teacher. The current arrangement, families teaching their own children supplemented by the minimal schooling the Reverend could provide, was inadequate, and the town had been trying to find someone suitable for 2 years. Julia looked at her. "I taught school for 4 years in Memphis," she said. "I know," said Dorothea, with the expression of someone who has been waiting to say something for a long time. Julia talked to Roscoe about it that evening. She was aware of the complexity of the arrangement, the ranch, the children, Tom, who was only 4 months old, the question of whether there was a way to do both things. Roscoe listened. He thought about it. "The school term," he said. 3 months in winter, 2 in spring. "That's the usual arrangement for a frontier school," she said. "And the rest of the year you're here," he said. "The rest of the year I'm here," she said. He nodded slowly the way he did when he was turning something over and finding its shape. "Then do it," he said. "You're sure? You were a teacher when you came here," he said. "I never thought that was something you were done with." He looked at her directly. "Are you?" She thought about Rosalie's focused frown over her letters, Me's slow and determined conquest of the horse books, Hattie's current and highly approximate attempts at arithmetic. She thought about the particular satisfaction of watching a mind open around something it had not known before. "No," she said. "I'm not." She began teaching at the Cutter's Creek schoolhouse in the autumn of 1880, and the school in October of that year had 14 students, ranging in age from 5 to 12, in one room with a good stove and windows that let in the afternoon light, and Julia taught them with the same plain and genuine care she had brought to everything else. Rosalie was in her class, which had required a brief and practical conversation between them to establish the parameters, and Rosalie had said, with complete composure, "I'll behave the same as any other student," and had done exactly that with one exception, which was that she was always the first to understand what was being taught, and sometimes, when the younger students were struggling, she would quietly explain it to the one sitting next to her, in a way that Julia found both useful and deeply characteristic. Me was not in Julia's class, being old enough for the older grouping, but she came to the schoolhouse with Rosalie every morning and left with her every afternoon, and she was working, by Julia's assessment, harder at her letters than she had ever worked at anything except horses. Tom grew. Hattie started school in the autumn of 1881, which she approached with a competitive energy that suggested she intended to master everything by Christmas, and largely did. The ranch settled into the rhythms of a family with a long future ahead of it, the kind of rhythms that are made from the accumulation of ordinary days and only become visible as a pattern when you step back and look. There were hard things, because there always are. There was a drought in the summer of 1881 that cut the cattle count and made for an anxious autumn. There was a hard fever that went through the household in the winter of 1881 that had Julia rigid with worry for a week, until it cleared and left everyone more tired than before but otherwise whole. There was the difficult Saturday in March of 1882, when Rosalie found a letter in her mother's handwriting in an old box under her father's desk, and brought it to Julia with an expression that was trying very hard to be composed. Julia had sat down with Rosalie at the kitchen table, and they had read the letter together. A letter Catherine had apparently written to her sister the year before she died, ordinary and domestic, and full of the textures of a life that was being lived fully before it was cut short. Rosalie cried, finally, the way she had apparently not allowed herself to cry in a long time, and Julia held her and let it happen, and did not say anything that was meant to make it stop sooner. Roscoe came in from the yard and saw them and understood without explanation, and he sat down on Rosalie's other side and put his arm around his oldest daughter, and the three of them stayed at the kitchen table until the crying was done, and then Julia put the kettle on and made tea, and nobody said anything that needed to be said because it had already been said in other ways. Later, when the girls were in bed and Tom was asleep in his crib and the house was quiet, Roscoe sat at the kitchen table with the letter in his hands, and Julia sat across from him, and she did not say anything at all, because there was nothing to say, because some things just need to be felt and witnessed and not helped. After a while he folded the letter carefully and set it on the table and looked at Julia. His eyes were clear but heavy. "She would have liked you," he said. "Catherine. She liked people who were direct about things." "That's a generous thing to say," Julia said. "It's accurate," he said. He looked at the table for a moment. "I don't say enough of the accurate things." "You say plenty of the accurate things," Julia said. "You just say them quietly." He looked at her across the table, and the lamplight was warm between them, and the house was solid around them, and she felt, as she had many times before and expected to feel many times again, the plain and irreducible reality of having chosen the right life. "I love you," he said, which was not something he said often, precisely because when he said it he meant it without reservation, and she felt the weight of it, the specific gravity of a word that came from someone who did not use it lightly. "I love you," she said back, and she meant it the same way, with full knowledge of what she was saying and who she was saying it to, not the idea of him but the actual him. The one who was tired and precise and sometimes quiet for the wrong reasons and always paying attention. The one who had carried Hattie up the stairs and refilled the kindling box and looked at her once across a sunset fence and not looked away. The spring of 1882 was a good one after the hard winter. The cattle numbers came back up with the rain. The school had 20 students by April, and Julia was beginning to push the town board for a second room and a second teacher, because 20 children in one room was too many, and the youngest ones were not getting what they needed. Dorothea Marsh took up this cause with a fervor that suggested she had been waiting for something worth organizing, and by June there was a second room being built on the north side of the schoolhouse, and a letter sent to the Teachers' College in Austin. Tom was 2 and walking with the particular determination of a 2-year-old who has recently discovered that walking is faster than crawling and intends to apply this knowledge to everything. He was beginning to talk in full sentences that were sometimes entirely clear and sometimes only interpretable by Hattie, who had apparently developed a fluency in 2-year-old that no one else possessed. He had Roscoe's eyes and Julia's coloring, and a personality that was entirely his own, cheerful and forthright and curious about everything. Rosalie, at 12, was beginning to become the person she was going to be, and it was a remarkable person, careful and clear-eyed and deeply kind in a way that operated without fanfare. She had started, under Julia's quiet encouragement, to think about whether she might want to teach someday herself, and she had sat in on several of Julia's classes that spring with the focused observation of someone who was learning a thing. Me was 10, and the pony that had been promised and delivered was named Copper, and was the great love of her life, and she rode him with a skill that Roscoe watched with something between pride and the slight alarm of a father watching his child do something fast. She had become a genuine reader by now, working her way through everything Julia could find for her, and she had a particular gift for story, for the shape of a narrative that Julia suspected would one day find its own form. Hattie was 7, and she was magnificent. That was the only word for her. She was bright and loud and tender and relentless. She learned things in enormous gulps and then moved on to the next thing with no diminishment of energy. She still brought Julia things she found significant, and the windowsill in Julia's room was now a full and organized collection. And she adored Tom with the territorial devotion of someone who had been the youngest and appreciated the shift in that status. On a September evening in 1882, when the summer's heat had finally begun to let go and the air had that first whisper of autumn in it, Julia was standing at the kitchen garden fence again, the same fence she had stood at the evening of that first October, watching the sunset do its immoderate best above the western horizon. She was aware of the symmetry of it without making too much of it. She heard the wagon coming in from the north pasture, Roscoe and Elia's wheeler bringing in the last of the late-season mending, and she heard Roscoe's voice calling something to Elia's, and then the horses were being put up and the yard was quiet for a moment, and then his steps came across the yard and he was beside her at the fence. He stood there for a moment, looking at the same sky. "There's something I should tell you," she said. He looked at her sideways. "Another baby," she said. "Spring, I think." His face did the thing it had done before, complicated and layered, resolving into something warm and specific. He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, the solid and reliable fact of him, and they looked at the sunset together. "How do you feel?" he said. "Good," she said. "Very good." He pressed his mouth to her hair. The sky turned from gold to rose to that deep, impossible blue. From the house behind them came the sound of Tom declaring something at volume and Hattie disagreeing at equal volume, and then Me's voice mediating with a calm that was new and promising, and then Rosalie's careful footsteps on the porch, and her voice saying, "Supper's nearly ready," out into the yard, meaning this is for my father and Julia both, because that was who they were to her now. "Coming," Roscoe called. He did not move immediately. He stood with his arm around Julia at the fence and the last of the sunset above them and the sound of their family inside the house behind them, and she felt his arm tighten just slightly, the kind of tightening that is not about fear but about holding something because it is good and you know it. "This life we've got," he said. "Yes," she said. "It's a good one." "It's a very good one," she said. They went inside together, into the warmth and the noise and the lamplight and the smell of supper, into the place that was theirs, that had been built from grief and from work, and from the kind of love that comes without announcement and grows without insisting on itself, the kind that is made not from a single large moment, but from the accumulation of 10,000 small true ones. Rosalie met them in the kitchen doorway with the pan of cornbread and an expression of 10-12-year-old dignified patience. Me was setting the table with Tom, helping, in the way that resulted in the spoons being in creative locations. Hattie was already seated, her dark curls in slightly less disorder than usual, her hands folded on the table, prepared to be patient for approximately another 45 seconds before she began to provide opinions on the pace of supper preparation. Julia took her place at the table and Roscoe took his, and the 5 children and the 2 adults sat down together to the meal, And outside the kitchen windows, the West Texas dark came in quietly and the stars began their nightly work. And the lamplight held the warmth in. And inside the Keller house everything was exactly as it ought to be, neither more nor less, fully and completely itself. The second child they were expecting arrived in April of 1883, on a morning that started cold and ended warm, with the creek running full and the mesquite beginning its fragrant yellow flowering again. It was a boy again, which surprised everyone in the pleasant way that the unexpected does when it is good, and they named him James, called Jamie from the first hour, and he arrived in the world with the specific healthy vigor of a child who intends to participate in things. And Tom, now 3, regarded him with a serious and proprietorial interest that his father found privately and deeply familiar. Roscoe stood in the bedroom doorway with Tom on his hip, watching Julia hold Jamie in the morning light that came through the eastern window, and Rosalie was sitting on the edge of the bed talking quietly to Julia, and Me was somewhere nearby being loudly enthusiastic, and Hattie was telling Tom in whispered tones about the responsibilities of older siblings. And Roscoe Keller looked at all of this and felt the specific and comprehensive gratitude of a man who has been given more than he knew how to ask for. Julia looked up and found him in the doorway, and her face was tired and radiant and absolutely known to him in every particular. And she smiled, and he thought, as he had thought many times before and would think many times again, that of all the useful and accurate things he had ever learned about the world, the most useful and most accurate was the thing he had not known that October afternoon when he had come to collect a woman from the post office in Cutter's Creek. The thing that she had walked steadily and directly toward and that he had arrived at eventually, because the best things require their time. That she was exactly right. That this was exactly right. That some things, when they fit not because they have been forced into a shape, but because they have been honest about what they are. And the space was there all along, waiting, full of the future. The Cutter's Creek School got its second teacher in the autumn of 1883, a young woman from Austin named Clara who had the right combination of patience and expectation that good teaching requires. And Julia supervised her first term with the same plain and genuine attention she brought to everything. And by spring, Clara was fully herself in the classroom, and the 28 students of Cutter's Creek were getting more than the frontier usually offered. Which was the thing Julia had always been most interested in. Roscoe expanded the ranch in 1884 with the purchase of the adjacent 300 acres to the north, which had been part of a neighboring family's land, and came up for sale when they moved to California. The Wheeler brothers were full hands now, part of the place in the way that good people become part of the places they work. And Elias Wheeler had married a woman from Redmond named Pearl who came to be a neighbor, and eventually a friend of the kind that the frontier made, practical and warm and not prone to ceremony. Rosalie Keller turned 15 in 1884 and was, by any fair accounting, the most capable 15-year-old in Cutter's Creek. She had begun to assist Julia in the schoolroom on Thursday afternoons, and she did it with the same natural authority that she brought to everything, the children responding to her with a respect that was freely given. She was going to be a teacher. This was simply a fact already visible in her, the way the shape of a canyon is visible in the water that made it. Me, at 13, was her own entirely different kind of force. She had started writing stories in one of her journals, the ones Julia had kept her supplied with, long rambling adventures featuring horses and weather and characters who were clearly composites of people she knew, and she shared them sometimes with Julia in the evenings, sitting at the kitchen table, and Julia read them with genuine attention because they were genuinely good, with the kind of detail and momentum that were not taught but grown. Hattie was 9 and loud and brilliant and kind, and continued to be magnificent. Tom was 4 and Jamie was 1, and the house was full. On a Sunday afternoon in October 1884, exactly 6 years after the stagecoach had deposited Julia Boone outside the post office in Cutter's Creek, Texas. She sat on the porch of the Keller Ranch in the autumn sun with Jamie in her lap and Tom chasing something through the kitchen garden, and the three girls visible in the distance, Rosalie and me on horseback and Hattie running to keep up below them, her dark curls flying, her voice carrying across the yard. Roscoe came and sat beside her, as he did on Sunday afternoons when the work allowed it, and he put his arm around her and she settled against him, and Jamie reached up with one small hand and grabbed his father's collar with the absolute authority of a 1-year-old who considers this his right. 6 years, Julia said. Since you told me my timing was fine, he said. The smile was in his voice. I stand by it, she said. He kissed the top of her head. Tom shrieked with delight at whatever he had been chasing, and then fell down and picked himself up with the stoic practicality of a Keller and kept going. Hattie's voice reached them, singing something tuneless and committed. The land spread out before them in all its enormous western beauty, the grass golden in the afternoon light, the sky doing what the sky here always did, being more than you remembered to prepare for, being vast and clear and full of a blue that had no name exactly adequate for it. Julia looked at all of it, and she felt the full weight and richness of it, the particular and irreplaceable realness of a life that had been chosen and built and was still being built, day by ordinary, extraordinary day. This was the thing. This was the thing she had come west for, though she had not known it, not any single part of it, all of it together. The man beside her, whose quietness was attention and whose words were always accurate, and whose hands had built this place piece by piece and would go on building it. The daughters who were becoming their own remarkable selves, Rosalie the careful and capable, me the story keeper, Hattie the magnificent. Tom running through the kitchen garden with no hat on, which Roscoe was about to notice and say something about. Jamie's hand in his father's collar. The sunset that was beginning, even now, to light up the western edge of the sky. She had broken the rule on the first day, and he had forgiven her immediately, and she had understood in that moment something true about who he was, that the rule had been his grief speaking, and the forgiveness had been himself, and the self he was underneath the grief, and the tiredness was exactly the self she had been looking for without knowing she was looking. I have something to tell you, she said. He looked at her, and there was something in his face that was both the readiness of a man who has learned to receive news and the beginning of something that might be anticipation. She smiled. Another one, she said. Autumn, I think. His face went through its familiar journey of processing and arrived, as it always did, somewhere warm and certain. He pulled her closer against him and rested his chin on her head and looked out at the land and the sky and the girls on horseback in the distance and Tom in the kitchen garden and the evening coming on. This life, he said again, which was what he always said, which was what he meant when he said it. This life, she agreed. Around them, the West Texas evening settled in with its enormous quiet, the stars beginning their first faint appearance in the east while the west was still burning gold, and the Keller Ranch was alive and lit and full of the particular sound of a family that is thoroughly, completely, and exactly itself.